coming. I'm really excited about what we're covering today as we come back from summer and getting back to business. And we wanted to really start with our go-to-market episode. So we have today with us, we have Brittany Ryan and also Arieann DeFazio. So I will let them give a little bit about how their journey, a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll get back right into their questions. So thank you so much and welcome.
Hi, I'm Brittany Ryan. I am based outside of Boston, and I have my own consultancy focused on health tech go-to-market strategy. Really excited for today's discussion. Thanks for the opportunity.
Hey guys, I'm Arieann DeFazio. I've been founding, managing, and running startups for about 17 years now. I believe I'm on my 8th or 9th. It depends on what you count. I've actually had the unique pleasure of founding a company, running it for 6 years, and being able to sell it to a strategic acquirer. And I've worked in a variety of industries, so I kind of had my fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak. I've done medical device, education, software, hardware, like you name it, I've probably touched it at some point. I've launched over 20 products in my career as either the lead product owner and sometimes, honestly, the lead designer of those products. And currently, I am a fractional COO for startups, and I help CEOs and boards really solve their biggest issues. So things that I've done are like retooling supply chains. You know, if someone's having an issue, they're all in spreadsheets, but it's a multi-million-dollar business, we got to get that fixed. Regulatory affairs and quality management systems. And I also really help companies with international expansion since I've worked in a number of countries, including Australia and the UK. So that is my spiel for this morning, and I'm stoked to hear you guys' questions.
Great, thanks so much. And just for those who are first time joining us to our Founder Hour, we do this mostly on a monthly basis. And the goal and the purpose that She's Independent and Your Cohort had was to have a place for both founders and leaders to be able to ask questions as we're having this conversation. So you don't have to wait until the end. If you have something you want to talk about, please feel free. And then at the end, obviously, we're going to leave some time to answer any of your questions. Also, make sure you go into She's Independent. If you're a founder and you want to sign up to our newsletter, please, you can go ahead and do that. And again, this is a partnership between She's Independent and Your Cohort to really support our founder community. So thanks so much. And let's get started as more people are trickling in. So let's start with the whole term of go-to-market strategy and what does it mean for each of you, just to sort of level set and ground set the term go-to-market. So Brittany, I don't know if you want to kick it off and go for it.
Yeah, so I think about go-to-market strategy as the fuller set of activities a company undertakes to support its solution. So that's everything from pre-launch market education about the problems it's addressing and the limitations of existing solutions to a company's customer engagement and sales approaches. When I think about a comprehensive go-to-market strategy, I also include the support a company intentionally wraps around its solutions, because those two contribute to solution engagement, ongoing utilization, and ultimately impact.
Great. Arieann, you want to give us a little bit of your definition?
Yeah, so very similar to Brittany. Again, I think when we throw the word go-to-market around, and I think this is mostly investors' fault, we almost always are talking about sales and marketing, but that is not actually what a GTM is. There's many other things that go into that, such things as, your supply chain, fulfillment, your product life cycle, shipping, regulatory concerns. These kinds of things are all part of your go-to-market strategy. I like to think of my go-to-market strategy as everything. It's not just how or who you're targeting. It's once you convince that person to buy, how are you going to make good on that promise? And that, to me, everything that's involved in making that promise come true is your go-to-market strategy.
Yeah, I guess how do you also make them come back?
Yes.
Right? Because it's great they came once, but the idea would be, how do you make that strategy just keep working so that you get that reoccurring. Definitely, I align with both of you. And so, Brittany, give us some insights to what companies should be, what kind of data and insights should companies be collecting when they're thinking through their go-to-market strategy from your perspective?
Sure. So there are a handful of questions I find companies at all stages often cannot answer about their solutions. And these are the things I really think about feeding into that go-to-market strategy and refining it on a regular basis. So the first question is, what are the core unmet needs your solution is addressing today? And why I call that out is often companies will answer this question with the laundry list of everything their solution could address over time. And I think it's this perception they need to be everything to everyone, especially when they're launching into a space with incumbents. And I think it's really about focus, not only for your team to rally around, but for your messaging and everything tied to your solution. So what are the core unmet needs your solution's addressing today? The second is, who will be the users of your solution? And how does your solution fit into their ways of working today? Is it aligned? Does it require fundamentally new ways of working? And what does that mean about how they're really going to adopt and utilize your solution, both immediately and over time? The third question is, how do your target users engage with your solution? And really understanding that ahead of launch, ahead of figuring out how to best support them with your go-to-market strategy. And what does that mean about your true value proposition to those users? And then related to that, what needs to be wrapped around your solution to drive adoption and ongoing utilization? The fourth question is, what are your target users' existing solutions, including workarounds? So everyone's come up with ways to solve problems that aren't the prettiest, but sometimes they're sufficient and they don't need a fancier solution to get by. And so how do those really align with the problems you're focused on solving? And are you addressing the key barriers they're trying to still overcome? And the final question is, how are those existing solutions competing in the market today? And how is your solution differentiated against those? And what else do you need to do to further stand out and compete effectively?
Got it. No, that's really, what would you say is, out of all the solutions, all the questions that you've said, which ones do you see being the one that people really skip over or don't give it the right value at the time of doing that?
Yeah, I think amazingly to me, and this is for companies who have been in the market for years and those just launching, many teams really don't understand how their solution gets utilized. And you could attribute that to, well, it's not fully built yet and they can't possibly know, but there's a lot you can learn as you're building the solution, including how your solution will fit into the day-to-day lives of users. So that's often a gap for teams many years in the market, many stages of funding later, and it's a pretty critical insight to not only understand whether you're really addressing the problem you think you are, but effectively engaging and supporting that user once your solution's launched.
Yeah, that gives me other questions, but I know we're getting into them, so I'm not even going to jump ahead. And I will actually pass this and segue into Arieann. What do you think are the common mistakes you've seen companies make in respect to how insights are being gathered and observed? And this is probably one of my favorite questions because it goes back to data.
Yeah, so I would say the number one issue that I've seen done repeatedly, and I think we've all been guilty of this at one point in our lives and another, is too much data. More data is not always the answer. What usually ends up happening is people get really excited and they're like, oh, we need to collect, like, I don't know, these 40 points of data. And it's like, without really any thought about like, well, how are we actually going to collect that? And why do we care about those numbers? I mean, it feels good and it looks good. But what I have noticed is it's just not really helpful for decision making at all. Like you just end up with analysis paralysis at some point, or you kind of burn your team out because they really don't understand why they have to go collect this number every month and it doesn't make any sense. So I would say that the biggest issue is most of the times people just kind of go overboard with data, where you can pick a few key things and just really understand why those are important to you and what you're looking for, like having a goal. and then having a regular cadence on how you check this stuff. So one of the other issues I've seen is not only too much data, but inconsistent. So instead of setting up a cadence where you're like, all right, every quarter, last Thursday of the month, whatever it is, we look at this data, here's the data, we know why we want to collect this data, we want to know what the goals are, and we have a discussion about like why we're not meeting those goals, or maybe we did. Is that indicating that we should use a different sales channel? Is this indicating that our product market fit is not there? Do some stuff, make some changes, and in another 3 months, we come back to it, kind of thing. So having a cadence and being really clear about why and how you're going to use this data is incredibly important. And that's the thing I see missed a lot.
I would even, maybe you've seen this too, where sometimes the data is being collected and it's being used by a certain department or team, but it's also not aligned with sales or marketing. And then I've seen that where not everybody's looking at the same data. You have one part of the business looking at one, and then you have another part of the business looking at another. And then that misalignment really impacts the go-to-market at the end of the day. And I don't know if you guys have experienced that.
I personally like to set up KPIs on levels in companies. So like I do think everybody does care about something. Like what a board cares about and what your senior dev cares about are very different things. So I think having a set of KPIs, or whatever you want to call them, is a level set thing at each level of your company. Like your execs are going to care about something, that number is important to them, but marketing is not going to care. So I do actually encourage teams to have their own, but there usually is like a core set out of those that the entire company cares about.
Correct. Yeah. Completely agree. Brittany,
Yeah. And I guess what I'd add to that is, and I think you were both alluding to it, having transparency to that fuller set of considerations and metrics is valuable to specific functions, simply because part of leveling up in anybody's role is being able to say, okay, here's what I care about, here's how I'm measuring success. But as I go to the leadership team, as I go to different audiences, as I help the leadership team prepare for a board meeting, here are the metrics that are top of mind for them, and really being able to think beyond my specific function as a marketer or as a sales leader, and take into account the fuller set of considerations they're making is critical. So transparency enables that, and also just helps for that cross-team alignment, as we were talking about.
Yeah, that very good points. And so I guess that makes me go to our next question, which is, how should companies think about the time that it takes for their go-to-market strategy to produce results? I know, especially when it comes to early stage startups, everything had to happen yesterday. And so I'm wondering, from both of your perspectives, how should they consider timing, and what's success around timing for their go-to-market strategy? And then also, what is the broader consideration or the top of mind of, like, as you guys are thinking through this?
Yeah, I would say it's always going to take longer than you think, is what I would say. Often, and again, when we're making our forecast, you got to make forecasts, right? Like, we got to have some sort of goals. But more often than not, when I see people make goals, you're kind of just, it's literally grabbing a number out of the air most of the time. You're like, I don't know. And for whatever reason, it always seems to be 100. I don't know why that is, but every CEO loves the number 100. So that always becomes like, we're going to sell 100 in the first month, and then it's going to go from there. What I will say is that never happens. I've not yet seen it happen. And it's going to take a lot longer to think. Usually, if you're a direct-to-consumer product, whatever you think it's going to take you, add 6 months to that. And that's probably when you're going to start getting to like any sort of real revenue. And the reason for that is because you can do everything 100% correct. You can do all the market research. You can do, your marketing team is 100% ready to go on launch day, but there's just real world factors that you cannot know about until you launch. And it's going to take your marketing team about 3 to 4 months to get through that, like tweaking the messaging, tweaking the channels, tweaking ad spend, things like this, to kind of help start getting those sales coming in. And you got to give them the time to do that. It's not going to fly off the shelves the second you launch it. It's not going to happen. So planning around that is very important. And I think one of the other big issues that I see is that founders will plan to have revenue when in reality, it almost never happens. And this becomes an issue because now you have to go out and raise more funds. Now you have a gap. Now you're having to do a bridge round at a lower valuation. So my number one piece of advice I usually give founders is like, just assume you're never going to make money and raise the money you need, assuming that. And then if you make money, fantastic. Now you could skip a whole funding round. Now you got a better story. It's a much better position to be in than assuming you're going to make a bunch of revenue and then not have it and then have to go out and do a bridge round.
Correct. I agree. Brittany?
So I similarly, I think teams often assume that if they do everything right ahead of launch, things should only get easier post-launch. And then it's all about quote unquote scaling. And I can't tell you how many business plans I read where teams show scaling beginning in year 2. So I think that's very akin to the revenue comment, that it's just sort of all up, downhill from there. And I think of launch and the period that immediately follows launch as this critical, all hands on deck learning period where teams figure out which assumptions were wrong and work together to reprioritize activities accordingly, sort of across go-to-market and the fuller set of functions. And it's during this period, it's really critical teams can communicate effectively across the organization and externally based on what they're seeing in the market. And I think the communication part and sort of the effectiveness of that becomes really underrated and undervalued when it's really critical to timely decision-making, both internally and that responsiveness to customers. And the other thing I'll call out is following launch of a solution, many leadership teams too quickly shift to focus on customer growth rather than continuing to focus on how to deliver really extremely well and learn as much as possible in the present to fuel that future growth. And that sort of mindset shift to, well, how do we sell 100 or sell as many as possible in X months because that's what we wrote down, takes away from that delivery in the near term and really focus on equipping their teams to do their best work and serving customers as well as possible. So what ends up happening is by not learning from their immediate experiences in the market and incorporating that into their revised go-to-market strategies, teams end up just scaling go-to-market strategies that are incomplete and ineffective because they've sort of jumped ahead and focused on that next milestone instead of what they can learn right now.
Yeah, one of the things I see frequent is that once they start gathering some data, if the data isn't what they thought it was going to, then automatically they shift the tactic, or they shift their go-to-market strategy, which instead of looking at it, that's a point of data that you just gather, wait until the whole process has gone through and that you've had enough time. And then analyze that data as to why there was an uptick, or why was that something that came into play when you were not expecting it, instead of just in the middle of it shifting and going towards what that data. I've seen that, and I don't know if you both have experienced that.
Yeah, there's definitely this aspect of sufficient patience to learn. And it comes from a variety of factors we've already talked about, including investor pressure, unfortunately, where teams feel the need to shift gears too quickly, and they confuse that responsiveness and quickly changing tactics with doing something differently or doing something new as sufficient to really understanding the fuller picture.
Yeah. So I guess this is a great segue to Arieann. As you know, early stage startups have limited capital. They have a runway of 12, 18 months, which at the end of the day, it's not a lot. So how would you recommend for founders to think through their setting up their back office, their processes, and how to best collect all this data to drive better decision making?
Yeah, I would say it's painful, but a little bit more upfront work and costs will save you a literal ton of headaches and costs in the future. People are the number one cost in startups. So the more that you can automate or semi-automate, the lower your burn's going to be, the less money you have to go raise, the longer your runway is going to be. And honestly, the less you raise, the more equity you're going to have. So this kind of has like a real building potential behind it. And, you know, setting up things like your company cadence, project management software and methodologies, you know, a quality management system, maybe depending on what your product is, you know, SOPs, setting up really concrete ways of working. This may all seem like massive overkill when you're 5 people. And to be fair, it is. But you need to do it at that point. And the reason why is because when your product does succeed, if you do hit your product market fit, if everything goes exactly according to your highest expectation plan, you will no longer have time to do any of these things. And you will just be so busy trying to keep up that you won't be able to set up these systems. And what ends up happening is instead of having, you know, a great process around how customer feedback is getting back into your product team, they're just going to hack it together. Like people, kind of what Brittany said, people will find a way. So if you don't lay that way out, and this is how we work in this company, this is how we do things, here's the KPIs we track, here's why, here's how often we look at them, people will just start doing things, and they will do things that's the best way and most convenient way for them. And then they'll teach all the new hires their way. So it's better to have the way that, be very intentional about how you want your company to work, and start that when you're like just a couple people, because every successive hire then gets trained on this way of working as opposed to it just randomly happening. I think going a little off topic here, but when people think about culture, you know, this is something that's very stressed to startups. You gotta have a good culture. People bring in consultants to like do culture or whatever that means. But I think culture to me is actually setting up your processes, because if you don't, the culture is just going to be whatever it is. Like, it's just going to happen. Whereas if you are intentional about setting up how you want this company to run, the processes behind it, your philosophies behind these things, then it becomes only the people that want to do those things or are capable of doing those things fit into that box, and you end up building the culture intentionally. So I actually think process comes before that. And it's hard because you do have to spend money and time on things that don't really seem that necessary at the time. Like, you're like, most people are like, I'm 5 people. Why do I need to have like a whole way of developing products and projects and things like that? It's like, well, because you don't need it today. You're going to need it a year from now. And it's going to take you that long to get it right and get it figured out and get everybody on board. If you wait till your company's 30 people, the cost and time to make those switches goes up exponentially. So do it while you can. There's tons of SaaS products out there that do about everything you could possibly think of. Use them. It's a lot cheaper than hiring a person, you know, $70 a month to, you know, like get some data out of something and put it into a dashboard is going to save you a whole human. And those people are a lot more expensive than that software is. So, you know, keep your head count low and develop things with automation, put the time and effort in at the beginning. It's gonna serve you very well.
Yeah, I completely agree. In order to scale, once you hit it, you're better off doing all this before. I think especially you and I get called into a lot of these projects as fractionals to come and clean up and do that system implementation after the facts, which that ends up costing a lot more. And founders don't realize that right now it's the best time when you're starting. It's the best time to put those disciplines in, whether you need to use them all today or they come along as you scale. And so I guess, Brittany, from your experience, what are some of the challenges companies should avoid post-launch? After a go-to-market strategy, after they've, you know, implemented everything and rolled out their strategy. What is your experience in that?
Yeah. So if you're designing a go-to-market approach with the mindset that launch is just the beginning for your solution and is this period of continuous learning and revisiting assumptions rather than a checkbox that allows you to move on to focusing on growth, you're more likely to resource the right things to support your solution and your team's success. So I'm 100% on the same page about the culture point. And I imagine as fractional executives, you're often helping leadership teams back into core strategic decisions they didn't make. They not only did they not put the process in and do that thinking up front, but you also have to help them appreciate that the core decisions that they potentially put off as an organization that are relevant to the processes and everything else you're trying to solve for in the short term. Something that many companies undervalue specifically is the role of thoughtful, regular internal and external communications as a part of their go-to-market strategies. And I think this is very aligned to the previous point around culture, because I think of communication and doing it really well as integral to a really strong culture and making people feel informed and equipped to do their jobs, affect their jobs, whether they're your customers and they use their solution as a tool, or your teams that are building the next thing and they don't fully understand the strategy. That communication becomes critical to them feeling equipped to do their job, continue to work hard, everything else. It all relates to the overall culture and willingness to keep moving forward. So the core point there is you need to bring your team, your customers, and your broader stakeholders that you need to influence along with you. And if you design your go-to-market to make all of these groups a part of the journey, if you think about it that way, rather than thinking of customers in particular as sort of a captive audience for one-way communications, the stronger your go-to-market approach will be. And you'll learn faster because it will be this two-way dialogue rather than what we've all experienced, where companies spend so much time pitching and selling the next thing that there's no time in any discussion with customers to really understand what's changed on the customer side. What do they need now? What feedback do they have on your product? And again, if you can learn faster by enabling that two-way communication, you're more likely to be responsive in the right way and resource the right things.
Yeah, I completely agree. I will say, as a fractional CFO, it's so essential, the two things that you guys have brought in, because I've seen forecasts being missed because the right processes were not there, or the right thought to what they needed to do in order when they hit go-to-market strategy. And I've also seen budgets being blown away because they had to spend more money trying to keep up with that strategy that did come to fruition. So as a CFO, as a fractional CFO, I've seen this all the time. And then, it's common that our founders say, well, I didn't have the capital, I didn't have the resources, or I didn't have the people. Again, to Ariann's point, just lay out the groundwork, whether that is with tools, and really think through that, take that time, because it does impact your runway. I see it at least once, a month. I see this with founders. So before I keep going to the other questions, I just want to make sure I open it to the floor. If anybody has any questions so far, anybody have any looking for our thoughts, our input, happy to do that now, or we can keep going, but I wanted to give everybody a chance. No? Oh, good. Okay. So we'll keep going away. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. So Brittany, as a company evolves the strategy, what do teams need to proactively do to ensure that they bring their existing prospective customers along with them in that journey that you were talking about? Like, how do they bring them along and also evolve with them, right? I think that's also essential.
Absolutely. So I believe very strongly that everyone supporting a solution internally and externally, including channel partners, needs to be aware of the expectations a company has set with customers. I think that's a core foundational piece of it. And this will sound very boring, but it's really important for teams, no matter how small and nimble and fast, to keep track of what's been shared with every customer, existing and prospective, especially any roadmap commitments. We've all been in meetings where a customer asked for something and said, you know what, I could sign this contract tomorrow if you can promise me these things. And the company just says yes and commits to them and then doesn't think about them for another year. And so part of what I think about is your customers may be planning around the commitments you shared, whether or not they tell you they're doing so, and failing to meet those commitments may not just result in losing engagement from current users and future sales to the buyers within that customer, but may come with broader reputational damage, including peer organizations that you assumed you would sell to down the road. And what I've found is often companies make pretty decently sized changes to the problem scope they're solving, and that naturally results in a very different set of priorities, both in terms of product development, service support, and other areas. And I think companies need to take the time to evaluate how any strategy changes affect the commitments that they've made to customers and the messages out there in the market about what the company is all about and what the company will intentionally solve for over time. And then, reconciling that alignment and figuring out what the new messages need to be, back to that communication point and making that very intentional. I think it's important to communicate across parties, again, internally and externally, about the key shifts you made and what it means for each audience. I think about this as, from the perspective of an employee, a customer, an investor. Whenever I hear about key strategic changes as an employee or a customer, investor, or partner, I want to immediately know what it means for me, if anything, including, since to the point about customers planning around the commitments you make, they've moved forward assuming they can rely on you. If that's no longer the case, you need to help them change their plans accordingly so they're not caught by surprise. The final thing I want to call out about this is some leadership teams choose to intentionally minimize transparency around strategy shifts with the fear of being perceived as wrong or incompetent. And this really serves nobody well, including the leaders themselves. Strategy changes mean you're learning and evolving your business, which is why you're in charge to begin with. And what I'd say to founders is, rather than worrying about how you'll be perceived as a leader, focus on the fact that your team, your customers, your partners, and others cannot succeed without knowing what's changed and the rationale. So equip them to succeed and your team to succeed by maintaining transparency and providing timely communication so they feel supported.
Yeah, completely agree. Arieann, I don't know if you want to add something, but I definitely have a question that is targeting to you.
Oh, what was the question?
The one I wanted to go in with you is about determining the best KPIs based on what Brittany has said, and based on what we've been talking about. It all comes around to, again, collecting the data, understanding that data, and then how do we determine, again, to your point, not having 40 points to track, what are the best KPIs that we should be measuring when we do go to market?
Yeah, so what I will say is, again, kind of my answer to the other question, less is more here. Ideally, when I'm helping companies set up, what their goals are, what they're going to track in order to make sure they're getting to those goals, I usually say absolute max 3 to 5 things, 3 to 5 numbers, whatever it is, 3 to 5 points of data, but I say per team. So, or per level, per company. So like maybe the board has 3 to 5 things they care about. The exec team has 3 to 5 things they care about. The product team has 3 to 5 things they care about, right? Each team should be encouraged to make their own decisions around this. Because again, the different levels of the organization care about different things. I think there should be no more than 10, and I mean it, no more than 10 core KPIs across your entire company. If you're doing more than that, you're probably not going to make a decision off any of those. Because you're not going to be able to actually analyze that data. You don't have time to analyze that kind of data. So, having 3 to 5 and then making the teams part of this. This isn't something that should come on from high. This is something that they should figure out themselves. And you guys should come together with the discussion about, most importantly, and Brittany kind of brought this up in her last answer, the rationale behind the KPIs is incredibly important. So, we're not just tracking revenue to track revenue. We're tracking revenue because, we need to make sure this is higher than our ad spend or we're in trouble. You got to give a 1 to 2 cents. And I usually have it on a big board with all the KPIs. So while each team is responsible for only 3 to 5, or only cares really about these 3 to 5, they can see all the other ones, you know, just in case they want to. But next to that number is also, here's why we're tracking that. And then next to that number is, here is our goal for the month, quarter, year, whatever it is, whatever you set up your cadence to be time-wise. So people have like context on this, because just collecting numbers doesn't do anybody good. In fact, you know, what I've seen that do to people is they just completely disengage from the concept of a KPI, and they become effectively useless, because they're like, all I'm doing is checking a box at the end of the month. I have to go track this data down. I put this in a spreadsheet. We never discuss it. You know, like, so, you know, everybody will just start disassociating from this, and then it becomes very much a useless exercise, and you don't have time for useless exercises. So again, while the exact KPIs will depend on your business, so I can't give you an answer here and be like, you should track these 10 things, because honestly, it depends. It depends where you're at in your company's cycle. It depends who your team is. It depends what your product is. It depends who your customers are. So you can look online, though. There's usually, you know, if you Google like a master list, if you're having a hard time thinking about them, there's tons of lists online where you can go, oh yeah, I really like that one. Also, another thing to consider, keep in mind that there's two types of indicators, leading and lagging. Most people, when they set up KPIs, will set up lagging indicators. So for example, sales is a lagging indicator. That's like the last thing that happens, right? So if something's going wrong upstream, you're going to have absolutely no clue until you start noticing your sales numbers are going down. And then you're going to have to backtrack and figure out why that's happening, because it already happened. Whereas if you have like what they call leading indicators, that something might kind of give you a heads up before you start to see your sales numbers go down. So I like to think of KPIs as kind of like looking at the dashboard of your car. Like, what are your RPMs? What temp is your engine at? You know, things like that. Those are indicators that'll let you know before something goes wrong, and you should set up as many of those as you can. So I usually like to say do half leading and half lagging. And that way you'll have a nice balance of, you know, kind of trying to see into the future and also tracking what's already happened.
Yeah, that's actually, I love that. I love that. Even that metaphor, it's a great one. I'll add to that also that definitely your KPI should have whatever you promised the investor. So if you told the investor you were going to do X, Y, and Z, they're going to ask you, they're going to come back and ask you, where are you with X, Y, and Z? So for sure, part of your KPI should be that. So you're not just tracking that for your quarterly report to investors or whenever you're doing that communication. Make sure that part of your KPIs is whatever you promise the investors and whatever you're sort of calling out on your deck.
Yeah.
So
that's an incredibly important point that I did forget to mention, is that these KPIs should be based on your goals, which means you have to figure those out first. So, you know, the board and the CEOs and the executive team should be like, this is where we're going. Here are our goals and here's why. And then give that to the teams and be like, okay, here's where we need to get to. You tell me how we're going to get there. And also, how are we going to set up a dashboard to make sure we're going to get there? What are we going to track to make sure we're on track or off track? So it always starts with your goals. Yeah. That's an incredibly important point.
Definitely. And so one of the not last questions, still have two more, but for both of you to participate and answer, early stage companies, and this is something I'm seeing a lot, especially in the current market we're in, they tend to do pivots. And one that is happening a lot in this market is that people are realizing that D2C has a huge marketing capital requirement. So a lot of are now testing this B2B, moving into the B2B market. And so I'm wondering, what is your recommendation when doing a go-to-market strategy, especially if you've already established some business or some revenue or some type of customer on the D2C side? You don't want to just run and abandon that and now shift the entire company into a B2B model because you found that might have a better outlook or has a bigger recurring revenue. So I'm just curious, how do you manage a pivot and make sure you're being capital savvy?
I can start us off. I guess one observation is many companies end up making this shift because they lacked key customer and market insights that should have been foundational to their go-to-market approaches. Unfortunately, not because something fundamental in the market shifted. And so two thoughts on things to keep in mind as you pivot. The first is changing your customer target does not on its own equip your company to succeed with your new customer target. You still need to understand and refine all of those same questions we talked about up front and answer those for your new target audience. And you need to continue to operate with the recognition that those assumptions need to be revisited and refined over time. They are not static. Making the decision to change target customers does not sort of free you up to do things differently in that regard. The other thing I'll call out is for companies switching from B2C to B2B particular, is that buyers and end users can be very different audiences with different needs. And teams focused on B2C can mistakenly over anchor on one of those audiences, buyer or user, to the exclusion of the other. And that really challenges go-to-market success. You need to develop an understanding of both and the fuller set of stakeholders you're serving in that B2B context and figure out your value to each audience. Sharing the same set of messages about your solution with your new audience, which is a typical approach, may not be effective, and you need to revisit the fuller set of tactics within your go-to-market approach once you solidify your understanding of the relevant stakeholders.
Arieann, any thoughts?
Yeah, what I would say is this is not a minor switch. So I think people do this a lot where they're like, okay, and kind of to our point we were talking about earlier with the sales strategy, and it's going to take longer than you think. I think there's just panic and anxiety that develops when you're not hitting your targets for the first 3 months that you went to market with, or, you know, this arbitrary 100 number you came up with, you're not meeting it. Something must be wrong. Maybe we should go to B2B. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe this isn't a D2C thing. Again, this is why knowing why you're tracking something, what your goals are, and your cadence for analyzing and responding to that is incredibly important, because it'll stop you from making emotional knee-jerk reactions like this. Because moving B2C to B2B or D2C, whatever you want to call it, it's starting all over. You're literally starting at zero again. Even if you have a product, what are the chances that that product that works for a single individual is going to work for a company? Almost none. Like, there's very few products that work that way. You may be thinking, well, it's a distribution thing. That's different. That's not really B2B. That's you using a B2C model, but using distributors or using like large retailers like Target or something. That's not really B2B, but that also includes a lot of things you're going to have to switch. So I would say that it's literally starting over, and you have to restart your customer discovery process. You have to understand your new personas. You have to understand your new requirements for your product. You probably have to build a completely new product, or at least tear it down almost to the bones and rebuild it, which is going to take you at least a year. You know, you have to redo your messaging, who you're talking to. Your entire marketing team basically needs to switch, because everybody you hired is probably a D2C person, and they're not the same. So are you now getting rid of your entire marketing team and bringing in ones that specialize in B2B, or bringing in a sales team? Like, it literally is almost just restarting the company. So that's why I like really discourage people from making this switch, especially when you've only been in business for, like, let's say your market's been out for like 6 months. Like, don't panic. It's only been 6 months. Switching to B2B is not the answer here. It's just digging in. You made this product, and it's either going to work or it won't. And then I think that's the emotionally hard part for founders, is at some point you do have to put a stake in the sand, and you might be wrong, and your company might fail because of that. But if you try to do both, because I see companies do this as well, where they're like, oh, well, we're just going to have half the company focus on this and half the company focus on the B2B. Well, you're only like 5 people, 10 people, 20 people. That's a lot to put on a team, like, to do both. So, you know, pick one and stick with it, for like a year. And if you're still not seeing issues, or if what you're seeing is customers are coming out of the woodwork to you in a complete, like from a B2B perspective, in a completely different area, maybe you were just wrong about your product market fit, and there's customers ready to go and you can make the changes to the product. But unless you're seeing that, I don't see many reasons why a D2C company should switch, because it's literally a completely different company.
Not to add, and there's actually a question which I want to answer, but not to add that your cash flow is going to be impacted, because most B2B, the payment, you won't get payment until 90, 150 days.
Yep.
So that shifts your entire cash flow and your entire forecasting and budget. So that's something that a lot of times not thought about. But there's a question that I want to make sure we answer. So did you ever see success around being able to market B2B and B2C if it's a multi-platform product?
I have not.
Multi-platform meaning what, Alex?
Meaning that it's doing both. It's doing the B2B, B2C.
Oh,
I've seen it if that's the way you designed it. Back to Ariann's point, if that's how you designed the product from day one,
sure.
I have seen it. But if you're doing that shift, I have not. But I don't know if you guys have seen that.
I've only seen it done in stages after there's sufficient traction with one approach and teams feel like there's sufficient resourcing and bandwidth to take on that other customer approach. So no, it's a really great question. I'll have to think about that more, but not to date.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I really haven't seen it, but what I have seen work is kind of what I mentioned earlier, where you go from purely an e-commerce kind of situation, and then you merge that into more of a normal retail situation. It's kind of B2B light, if you will, because it does like change some things. It'll change kind of how your supply chain works, because the person maybe you got to do fulfillment is okay with sending 2 boxes to an individual, but they have no idea how to send 50 pallets to Walmart, right? So I've seen them transition to more of like a working B2B, B2C kind of thing with the middleman, but I've never really seen anybody successfully pull off a true D2C and B2B situation at the same time, mostly because you just straight up don't have the resources for that.
Any questions? I want to be mindful, everybody. That was a great question, by the way. So if anybody else has anything else, I'll wrap it up with our last question is, what are the initial signs that your current go-to-market strategy is effective? So what does success look like, and what can founders expect that are those key little signs showing up that they can feel like, okay, I'm getting somewhere?
So to continue the theme of leading and lagging indicators, perhaps, which I love, I want to share two indicators that I think are very important, but perhaps underrated for teams. That the first is that customers are sharing timely and candid feedback with you on your solution. And they're doing this because not only have you made it easy for them to contribute their feedback, but you've made it clear that you're there to listen and learn and grow with them, including as their needs evolve. You're taking the time to ask for their perspectives and respond. The other signal I'll share is that the cross-functional teams supporting your solution within your organization is all aware of ongoing customer feedback, key decisions that need to be made about the solution, and the recommendations shared with the leadership team thus far. Everybody's on the same page, and that really goes to effectiveness and alignment across the team that further fuels your go-to-market. And back to the point about culture and making them feel equipped to do their jobs, signals including their ongoing regular communication about needs and next steps for the solution are good indicators to me that not only are you being effective as a team, but you're in a good spot to serve your customers as best as possible.
I think the main thing that I would say is when it's easier than you feel like it should be. So you probably nailed it when you're just like, wow, this is a lot easier to sell than I originally anticipated. Or the big one is kind of, and again, this depends on if you're, what your product is, but return on ad spend is a big one. Like that is, to me, one of the biggest indicators of a company that's going to be successful. Because what ends up happening with a lot of startups is, yeah, sure, you can sell a lot, but you're always having to spend more to convince that person to buy than you're making off the product. So like, for example, Instacart's kind of a great example of this. Like that's what they've been doing for a really long time. And it's like, yeah, they have lots of users, but they're not making any money because it costs more to keep a customer than it does. Then they're making profit off that customer. So seeing that number, like your return on ad spend actually be like a positive number, is probably the best indicator that something is correct here. You have nailed your product market fit. Even if your overall sales numbers are relatively low, that's fine, because you can always up the ad spend, you can always up your reach. But if you're finding that you keep having to spend more money and more money and more money just to convince somebody to buy your product, that's a pretty good indicator something's horribly off here. So for me, it's like, yeah, if you're thinking those numbers are getting better over time, like it's getting cheaper to acquire a customer, they're staying for longer, your churn's lower, maybe they're starting to up the amount of product they buy. Those are all excellent indicators that you're onto something here. So I guess the bottom line is, if it's cheaper and easier to sell than it was the month before, and that pattern keeps continuing, then you've done a good job with your go-to-market strategy.
No, that's great. And no, thank you so much. Again, any questions, anything that you would love for us to give you our input, there's no raw right. We would love to be able to provide any support that you might be needing. No? Well, so with that said, thank you both for.
Alex, there's a question in the chat here.
Oh, that's the one that we asked. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay. No worry. And again, thanks so much for joining us. I'm also going to put on the chat that, as you know, it is Denver Tech Week. So they are our wonderful, She's Independent, hosting a happy hour. So I put it there. Our next founder hour will be in November, and we will be touching on benefits. A lot of you as a startup are probably thinking about healthcare benefits and how do you offer benefits and all of that fun, complex world. So we will definitely be sending out an invite for that. So thank you. And I look forward to seeing some of you in the next one.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care. Have a great
Bye.
one.
Bye, guys.